Hello everyone, welcome to a new video. My name is Roy, aka Bloody Bananas, and in this video we're going to talk about how to build the best data science resume. To give a little bit credentials about myself, I've been in the field of data science for some time. I've gone through several periods of job seeking when I was fresh out of school, when I was in school looking for an intern, and when I wanted to look for a new opportunity when I was already in the industry. So I've gone through so many iterations of resumes, and I think I have a pretty good idea of what resumes attract the recruiters and the hiring managers. Again, this is only my opinion, but we're going to dive very deep into the details and even give some examples on how you could improve your resume specifically. With that being said, let's start moving on. So we're going to talk about what makes up a resume, and in my opinion, these are what sections that you should focus on, and these are pretty much what you will see on the data science resume, right? So we're going to divide and conquer each section. The first part is a brief intro. So this is very, very basic information about yourself, your contact information, what you're looking for, very brief intro, right? And the next part is your education background. And this is just about your school major, concentration, GPA is optional. We're going to talk more specific on that later on. Coursework, again, I think it's optional depending on your level of experience. And then next up, we're going to talk about work experience. What could be your intern experience if you're still in school. I think this will be the most important part on your resume because this entails how you could apply your skills in a real life business scenario. And that's very, very important because the projects that you do in school is very different than the ones you will do at work, right? And next up, if you don't have any work experience, then you kind of have to rely on your personal projects. So these include side projects that you're just interested in doing. Could be your interests. Maybe you're interested in music and you want to, let's say, recreate some new music scores that are in the style of Chopin. And that's something that I totally did, and it was a huge failure, but it was still really fun, right? And if I was if I was still in school, and that's probably something that I will include on my resume anyways. And you're gonna have some school projects as well if you don't have too many other things you want to mention, and if your school project is very relevant to the industry, then you want to include that as well. Next up, we're going to talk about the skills. The skills, basically you want to hit all the buzzwords. This is actually very important if you are going through, if the interview is being scanned by a machine, then what they do is they're going to look for the keywords that I mentioned on the job description. And we're going to talk about those skills more specifically later. And then the last part, personally, I think it's optional. Obviously, not everyone will have these, especially awards, publications. But if you have them, then you definitely want to include them. As for activities, personally, I've heard many different debates on this. Some people think it adds a personality to your resume. It makes people more interested in knowing you. But I think a resume just helps you get to the interview, right? And then even if you get to the interview and the hiring manager is looking at your resume, they want to know how well you can do the job, right? I don't think it's the most important thing, unless it's very relevant. For example, if you just say you like music, then it just makes you sound boring because everyone likes music. If you say you like your cello is your passion on your activities, okay, how does that relate to data science? It probably means you're a boring person as well, right? No offense to cello players. I'm a huge fan of cello. Next up, let's just talk more specifically on the intro. So for the intro section, you want to be brief and concise. By that, I mean you don't want to take up too much space just about your intro. You want to have your contact information, And the next part, you want to include any information that gives you a direct advantage versus your competitors in your job search. For example, if you have done a lot of stuff on GitHub, you have contributed to some well-known repos, and maybe you have some well-known repos yourself, and that could be very important. That could show right away what you could do in a real-world work scenario, industry. Or maybe if you just did some research stuff, and that still is very, very important because it shows your fundamental skills, right? And then maybe you have done a lot of Kaggle competitions. You have active involvement in Kaggle. Maybe you've gotten top 5% before on a big competition, and I think 5% is like silver, so that's still pretty impressive. And you definitely want to include that as well. And the next part, not everyone will have them, but if you do, it will give you an advantage as well if you have green card or citizenship. I imagine a lot of people don't, but if you do, you definitely want to include this. And if you don't have them, it's still fine, right? This just gives you an advantage, but it doesn't necessarily mean you'll automatically get the job. And the next part, I think it's very optional as well about what strengths that you have in a very, very brief intro. And you really want to be brief about this as well, right? You don't want to give out too much information, otherwise it's going to sound very, very bland, and people are not going to read your entire intros anyways, right? It's going to have to stand out. For example, you have a ton of experience in data science, and then you're specialized in something that's very, very popular, NLP, machine learning, computer vision, anything like that, and then skills that you're strong at. So this is what you want to go about on your intro section. In the next part, we're going to talk about education background. So obviously you want to include all the relevant education that you have that is related to data science. You want to mention the coursework, but this is also entirely optional depending on your level of experience. And then GPA, again, optional depending on the level of experience. Basically, the more industry experience you have, the less important your educational background is, right? Because then your experience will speak for yourself instead of your education background. And I'm going to have two examples on how you could approach this depending on your experience. If you're fresh out of school, then this is what you want your educational background to look like. Let's say you had a master's degree in the quantitative field, stats, math, physics. Might not be that relevant, but I'm pretty sure that's still a good one. School, what GPA you had, and relevant coursework. Machine learning, intro to machine learning, programming, stats, probabilities. As for GPA, if you don't have a great GPA, I've seen a lot of debates on this, is if you should include your GPA if it's not too great. Personally, I think you should include your GPA as long as it's not terrible. Because let's say you have a 3.5 and you think it's not good enough, right? It's obviously not as good as 3.9. But if you don't include it on there, people are going to think the worst. People are going to assume the worst. That's just my opinion, right? If I see you just graduated from school and you don't put your resume, I'm going to think, why is he not putting a GPA on his resume? Is it below 3? Is it 3.1, just above 3? I'm not going to think, it's actually 3.6. That's not too bad at all. And then he didn't put it on there. So if you have GPA that's decent, you should definitely put it on there anyways. That's just my opinion. Again, I don't know exactly what they think. I've never had this issue myself, not to brag. But yeah, I still think it's better to have the resume if you're fresh out of school, or to have the GPA if you're fresh out of school. But if you're experienced, then this doesn't matter. No one cares. No one cares what coursework you had, and no one cares about what GPA you had in the past, because people are going to care about the work that you're doing, right? So, and that brings us to the most important thing in this video and in your data science resume, is your work experience. Again, this should follow. This should be very similar to the project experience, because essentially at work, data scientists are working on projects, right? So this shows the responsibilities that you have currently at your current job or in the past, and how well you can perform at a new position that you're applying for. And I'm going to mention the 3 do's and 3 don'ts, in my opinion, for this section. So let's go through the do's. First of all, you want to quantify your achievements. I cannot stress enough how important this is. If you mention a lot of things that you have done, but you don't mention how well it's contributing to the business, then it doesn't matter, right? If you're not adding value to the business, then why should they hire you, right? What's the point of even hiring you and working on this project? So this is something that you really want to mention and be specific about. Because if you say, oh, I helped the business generate more revenue. Okay, how much? Is it $1,000? Is it $1 million? Because those two numbers are very different, right? You could just say I improved the sales by 10%. Okay, now there's some numbers, and 10% could be pretty good, right? It's better to mention about you improved the revenue by 10% than mentioning that you improved the revenue by 1%, or just improved the revenue, because then people think it might be 1%. So yeah, you definitely want to be specific and about how you're contributing. Next up, apply your skills. So this is also very, very important. You want to add as many details as you could about your skills and how they're applied to solve the problem. Again, we're going to have a skill section that include the skills that you have, but this is where you can show the interviewer, you could show the hiring manager how you're using those skills, right? Because anyone can put what skills they have on their resume. You could say that I'm a rocket data scientist. I know to do everything on the skill section. Reinforcement learning, deep learning, machine learning. I can do engineering work. I can deploy everything. I'm a very strong programmer. You could put all of that on there. But if you don't mention any of the skills, then how are people going to know, right? So this is a good way to reinforce some of the skills that you mentioned under the skill section. And it really tells people that you really understand how to use those skills. And then the third important part is that you want to make sure that you're describing the problem. This is also very important because you want to describe what's at stake and why it's important, and why you're working on this. How can this problem contribute to the business yet again, right? How is it relevant? And that actually brings us to the first don't, is that you want to stay relevant. So don't emphasize any work that is irrelevant to the job you're applying for, right? Let's say you have done some UI UX stuff for web design. That's great. That's a fantastic skill. It doesn't really relate to data science at all, right? While it's really great, you don't want to mention that at all. Because again, it doesn't relate to data science. But if you're applying for UI UX designer, that's something that you want to include. And the next part is you want to tell the truth or as close as possible. I always think that a modest exaggeration is fine, but you don't want to lie about anything that you didn't conduct, right? Since you will be asked on the details on your resume during your interviews. And if you didn't do something, people are going to know. Let's say you did some reinforcement learning. People are going to ask very specifically, okay, what kind of reward function that you were using? What are some hyperparameters that you were looking into? And why did you take that approach? Did you try something else? And if you didn't do any of that, you're going to get caught, and it's going to be a huge red flag, and you're probably going to get rejected, right? So you definitely want to tell the truth, or as close to as possible. Definitely something that you have done. And the next part, you want to be concise and to the point. If you had too many details, so this part is very, very tricky, because if you had too many details, then it could very be distracting. Again, as long as they're relevant, I think they're okay. But you really want to be a very, very well organized structure, right? You don't want to mention something and then start another sentence to mention the same thing in a different way. But this is the 3 do's and 3 don'ts that I think are very important to your data science resume. Next up, personal projects. Again, like I mentioned earlier, this will be the most important thing on your resume if you don't have too much work experience. If you're just fresh out of school, then all the projects you're doing are basically your work experience. And it should include the same level of details as if the projects are from real industry work, right? And then they should follow the same format as the work experience. And then you want to include projects that are most relevant to the industry you're applying for. Because if you do the image classification and then you're applying for finance, then that might not be too relevant, right? But if you have a large arsenal of projects that you have done in the past, then you could select the ones that range through all different industries and apply to all those industries. But again, it really depends on your case. And next up, we're going to look at some examples on how you can improve personal projects and work experience on your resume.